Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host today, Steve Francisco. Today's guest, Jim Carlson, is a familiar face to many of our viewers. In fact, Jim, you may hold the record for the most appearances on Access to Democracy. I'm not quite certain. We may have to check with Alan Miller about that. But welcome to today's show.
It has probably been close to the most, I would say. Might be tied with a couple of other guests.
Yes, very good. Well, welcome to today's show. And I should tell our viewers, for those who may not be familiar with you, you're a lifelong resident of Eagan.
Yes.
Graduate of the University of Minnesota.
Correct, and Dunwoody Institute.
Dunwoody Institute. Worked many years as an engineer, I believe, at 3M.
At 3M and Ecolab. Yes.
And we should mention, too, that you and your wife Gail, is a teacher at Eagan High School and teaches German.
She has been there since the school opened.
Very deep roots in our community.
Yeah. And welcome to broadcast journalism,
Well,
Steve.
thank you. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity and to be able to chat with you today. In 1973, you'll recall this, you and I are old enough to remember this, Time magazine ran a cover story with then Governor Wendell Anderson holding a fish, and the title on the headline of the magazine that day was "The Good Life in Minnesota." And the article went on to talk about how Minnesota described us as the state that works. But a lot has changed in the past 39 years. In 2005, a DFL legislature and a Republican governor, Tim Pawlenty, failed to reach a budget agreement that led to the first ever shutdown of the state government, lasted for 9 days. Last year, in 2011, a Republican legislature and this time a DFL governor, Mark Dayton, were locked in another budget and tax stalemate. This time it led to the longest state government shutdown in U.S. history that lasted for 20 days while the state had its doors closed. In your view, what has happened in Minnesota during this time? What has changed about our politics and the difficulty of coming to consensus to act for the public good?
Deep question, and actually I think it started before 2005, the setup to the 2005 shutdown. And by the way, the shutdown in 2005 was really a partial shutdown as compared with the more complete shutdown this last, in 2011. In 2011, there was some departments that were kept open, the essential services, so-called essential services. But in the past shutdown, some of the bills had already been signed. So some parts of the state did stay open. But what led up to this was a shortage of money. It's no two ways about it. And in fact, I'm out door knocking these days, and people are bringing that up all the time. And I'm explaining that something happened back before that, before Tim Pawlenty became governor even. And that was when there was a cut in income taxes, a cut in real estate taxes, and Governor Ventura wanted to move the revenue generation to sales taxes. Many people have forgotten that what he wanted to do was tax clothing, food, and services. And there were too many people running for governor in the legislature at that time, and they didn't agree. And so they left a set-up budget shortfall, something that was going to happen. And then also we had a mini recession at that time. And so in 2003, the world fell apart, and there was $1.2 billion in the tobacco settlement that Governor Pawlenty took and put into the general fund. There were lots of other let's say reserve funds available, the healthcare access fund, some of those. So he managed to get through that biennium without doing a tax increase and without doing much of a substantial cut either. 2005 came along, and there were a lot of things that couldn't be done, and that did cause the disagreement and then the eventual partial shutdown.
But we seem to be in an environment now where Minnesota faces persistent budget shortfalls. There's already talk, as you know already, that the next legislature, which if you are successful and are elected in November this year, you'll be a part of.
That's right.
That we are undoubtedly, or looks most likely to be facing another very large deficit. We've borrowed money from the schools. We've made cutbacks in state spending on a whole range of issues. How are we going to solve the problem in the future?
Well, it's probably going to take some new look at taxation. Now, what originally caused the problem, again, was a cut in real estate, a cut in income taxes. And we did not expand sales taxes. And that's been looked at a couple of times. People have said many times that maybe we can cut our way into it, and that's just not true. We cannot cut any more than what's already been cut. And some people use the term waste in government. Well, we've trimmed down beyond the bone. We're into the supporting bone now. So it's very, very serious. We have pushed, we've borrowed more from the schools. So we can't borrow again, or maybe we could, but the schools would have to shut down.
And we should mention right now, the estimate is that the state currently owes Minnesota schools $2.4 billion.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on how we can begin to repay the shift? Is it possible to repay that shift? What can be done?
I would say that it's not possible to repay that shift if we don't make some substantial reforms. And I'm not saying that we should be closing down schools or going to 4-day weeks. What we need to do is we need to bump the revenue. That is absolute. When you said we have cut, yes, we have. We've cut, for instance, the homestead credit has been cut. It was forced onto the cities that they had to collect the money and then pay their own residents back. Well, that was now repealed, so now it was a what they call a market value credit that was put in. I'm sorry, market value reduction, and that selectively was applied to certain homes, but everybody else had to pay into it to make up for that, including commercial industrial property. So now commercial industrial, and they're starting to get the picture here that they've been used to pay for that credit, and so they're not happy with what's going on. The income tax has not been changed. It has not been changed for years now. The top tier is 7.85%. Now, we can say, okay, that's a fairly high tier, but maybe what we need to do is have more tiers and have, like Mark Dayton wanted to do, is to increase that 7.85 on the very, very wealthy. And I think that would probably help with the problem.
And isn't it the case that in this last session that the governor was not able to attract support for that proposal, but not only that, he wasn't able to attract support for raising any taxes, any revenue.
That's right.
And so we're in this situation of basically a stalemate where we're going to be back in the same place again.
We'll be back in similar place.
Similar place, perhaps,
but
yeah.
We cannot increase the borrowing anymore from the schools, because we're down into to actually having to shut down schools.
Right.
There was, I believe it was $400 million that was generated from the tobacco receipts. We get a perpetual settlement from the tobacco lawsuit that was settled years ago. And what happened this year is they took that perpetual fund and used that money to offset the debt service on bonds, and then took the money from the bonds and put it into the general fund. I always say what we did is we pawned our tobacco settlement. And that tobacco settlement, you got to remember, was originally for health care.
Health care programs.
Yes,
right.
and now it has completely been wiped out.
This year, it seems as if a big part of the session was dominated by actually a very old issue, and that had to do, of course, with whether or not the state would play a role in subsidizing the construction of a new stadium for the Minnesota Vikings. The breakdown, they did end up passing a bill, a $975 million stadium to be built in Minneapolis. The team will pay $477 million. The state will pay $348 million, and the city of Minneapolis will pay $150 million. Was this a good deal for Minnesota?
I would have to say no, it's not a good deal. It was an adequate deal. Sometimes you have to say this is as good as we're going to get, and in fact there was an additional $100 million that was in the last minutes of the negotiation. And you know, again, the main part of the bill was sponsored by Julie Rosen from Fairmont and Maury Lanning from up in the Detroit Lakes area. Two people who didn't live in the districts that are being taxed, interestingly, but I have to take my hat off to them. They stuck with it. They kept on. And then at the very end, they did get an additional concession from the Vikings, which I think they needed to be able to get some Republican votes. But it was really the Democrats that brought that bill home. The Democrats and Mark Dayton are the ones that twisted each other's arms and brought in the number of votes that were needed to get it passed. Now, is it a good deal? I can't really say it's a good deal. Everybody can find something that they don't like about it. But were we about to risk losing the Vikings? I think that we don't know what would have happened, and I don't think the risk was, the risk wasn't zero. And so is that a risk that we want to take?
Right.
And I think that's what we had to pay for, is we wanted to pay to completely eliminate that risk.
Now, if the legislature could just pass a bill mandating that the Vikings win a Super Bowl, maybe everybody would be
Yes.
more pleased with that. I'd like to turn to another couple of issues. This session, in addition to the stadium, was also a large part of the focus of this session was on constitutional amendments to the Minnesota State Constitution. And as you know, the legislature ended up approving 2 of these proposed amendments for the ballot. They will appear on the ballot in November. One is to require some type of identification at the polling place before people will be allowed to vote. And the second deals with the issue of whether or not same-sex couples will be precluded from ever marrying in Minnesota as a result of a constitutional amendment. Let's talk about the voter ID amendment first.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about that, and as we go forward here, and how would you have voted had you been in the Senate this past session on the voter ID amendment?
Now, the voter ID amendment has been undergoing a marketing program that where we talk about the number of fraudulent voters, all that sort of thing, which is actually patently untrue. There are some people, and it does depend on what you determine is fraud. Is voting as an impersonator a fraud? Is voting when you were a felon and didn't know that when you got out that you could vote or could not vote, or that when you finished your probation after you got out of prison from a felony conviction, could you vote? A lot of those people who voted were not unaware that their rights had not been restored. And that's something that there was a bill in the legislature to advise those people so that they don't vote. There's quite a few of them. I mean, it's a couple of, I think it was even more than 1,000 people in that category. But that doesn't really constitute voter fraud when you were registered and now you're out of prison and you're voting because you thought.
There's not an intention to fraudulently vote. Maybe somebody was misinformed.
It's a very important point.
But what do you say to the average Minnesotan who says, you know, when I go to the airport to fly, I have to show a photo ID, and when I go to cash a check at the bank, I have to show an ID. And the public opinion polls seem to indicate that a lot of people don't think this is such a bad idea.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
they're also missing the point about how many eligible voters may potentially be disenfranchised. There was a story in the news from Florida yesterday where Florida is implementing a new voter ID process. And I believe some of the news media organizations have discovered that they are proposing to purge tens of thousands of people from the voting rolls, including people who are in fact eligible. One was a decorated World War II combat veteran who would be disenfranchised as a result of Florida's voter ID law. Do you have similar concerns with what may happen here?
Absolutely. You asked several questions there. One of them is I would have voted against it. The other one that's really important was we have people that are going to be disenfranchised. And about the airport thing, none of those are rights. We have the right to vote that people have died for. People we've fought wars over making sure that every citizen can vote. This is a sacred right, and we should be encouraging everyone to vote. In fact, there are places like Australia where you get fined if you don't vote.
If you don't, right.
And we need to make sure that everybody participates in government, not that we figure out a way to carve out some people that we don't like.
And Minnesota traditionally has had, I believe, the highest or one of the highest voter turnout records of any of the states. It's interesting, I was noticing there was a study by New York University's Brennan Center which looked at the issue of what has actually happened to voter turnout in states where they have these photo ID requirements. And they noted that between 2002 and 2006, states that required photo voter ID saw the lowest percentage of voter turnout, approximately 37%. And in Minnesota, in the last presidential election, I believe we led the nation. It was close to 60% of eligible voters, or more than that, actually turned out and voted.
One thing very important, and if there's anything that has to come across here on discussing the voter ID amendment, is that once that amendment is approved this November, it immediately repeals the right for military to vote. It repeals absentee voting. It repeals same-day registration. And the reason that it repeals it is there is nothing in the law that allows or defines how those people can vote. They call that enabling legislation. And the people who passed this completely ignored that, and what they said is, we'll take care of that later. Okay, we'll take care of that later. And if this particular amendment passes, those people will lose their right to vote. And then sometime in the legislative session, if they feel like it, the legislature will restore each of those groups their vote. And if they don't want to restore the vote of students, they won't do it.
Right.
If they don't want to restore the vote of seniors, they won't do it. So each of those will lose it, and that does include military, because you cannot show a valid ID at the polls when you vote from a base overseas.
So what you're saying is we could have active duty soldiers serving this country abroad.
Fighting for the vote.
That's right.
Not being allowed to vote. Yes, that's absolutely a flat-out fact.
Let's talk about the other amendment that I was asking about, and that is the one relating to a constitutional amendment to basically preclude same-sex couples from ever being legally married in Minnesota. National polls and Minnesota polls seem to be tracking this as well, that support is growing for equal recognition of the legal rights of people who choose to be married who may be same-sex couples.
Yes.
And we have a lot of couples here in Minnesota too. What are your thoughts about this particular amendment that the voters will be asked to render judgment on in November?
Well, primarily the objections to the marriage amendment, or the support for the marriage amendment, comes from the objections that were religious. And marriage is not a religious construct. It is a government construct. It is a civil construct. You don't have to be religious to be married. Atheists can get married. I've heard one person say, you can go to Las Vegas and get married tomorrow, getting a license instantly, and have an Elvis impersonator marry you, and you will be married. You will be married in Las Vegas, you will be married in Nevada, and you will be married in Minnesota. But if you don't get that license, if you don't get the civil construct, you're not married, no matter what church you go to.
And we should mention, too, that, in fact, just yesterday, a court in Massachusetts, in Boston, basically invalidated part of the DOMA, the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, because it contended that it was unconstitutional to deny equal protection to the marriage rights of same-sex couples.
That's right. And actually, I've heard what's going to happen in the not-too-distant future is the American military is going to be fighting some of those laws in each of the states because they have military veterans, disabled vets, all sorts of people who are getting military benefits, and the military does not discriminate between same-sex and opposite-sex couples. They can get married in Massachusetts, and then they can move from Massachusetts, and they still can get their military benefits as though their marriage is recognized in the state that they reside in. So the military is going to take a hard-nosed attitude on it. So they are going to push this across the nation also.
Okay.
You know, as we get through life here, you know, the young people could care less. It isn't important. It isn't important to me. I've been married to the same woman, my first wife, for 41 years now, and I've never felt my wife and I were threatened by our gay friends. Not at all.
No.
And I just don't understand people who say that our marriage is threatened because we've never felt it. I don't think that it's true, and I think that, you know, our same-sex couple friends ought to be able to make a commitment and be able to live to that commitment, and then also get the legal benefits of that commitment that my wife and I have.
Right.
So really, it makes no difference to me. If we're going to make a change in law, let's make divorce a felony. You know, let's do something like that.
But I know you're joking about that,
Yes,
but
of course.
the point is well taken, though. That,
Yeah.
and I agree with that.
The only
too.
threat to marriage is divorce.
Right. Let's turn our attention to a couple of amendments that didn't make it to the ballot, but that the next legislature is probably going to have to address. One of those would require a supermajority to raise any state taxes, income tax, sales tax, any tax. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that was something that started out with the term TABOR, Taxpayers Bill of Rights.
A misnomer in the view of many people.
And it's passed in a couple of states, and it has been repealed in some of those states. And each of those states that passed it, they regretted it.
Colorado, by the way, was one of
yes,
those
the
states
big one.
that we've heard
Yeah.
about which passed this and came to regret it.
Without having to have a supermajority of something like that, and not having to have a supermajority to get an amendment on the ballot is the reverse of what should be true. We don't need that sort of thing in Minnesota, and it would hamstring the state budget forever.
And how about the issue of right to work? There were very vocal protests at the state capitol back this winter when the legislature was looking at getting Minnesota to join the list of states which are so-called right to work states. Really a misnomer, because adopting such an amendment doesn't guarantee anybody the right to work, but it basically would preclude union members from getting their share of dues, which pays for representation of workers in a bargaining unit. What are your thoughts about this amendment?
Well, union membership has gone down substantially in the last couple of decades, and maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but you should have the right to bargain with your employer, whether it's a union, whether it's an association. There still are associations that are not connected with a national union, but the associations and unions bargain for a salary schedule, they bargain for safety in the workplace, they bargain for vacations, for retirement, you name it, all of those kinds of things. And when I go to work at my 3M employer, a lot of those benefits are the result of those kinds of negotiations. And so I benefited from the unions that have negotiated the 5-day work week. Now we're looking at something where you can get those benefits, but you don't pay into the group that is fighting for those, that negotiates those.
So basically,
So
it sets up a situation where people are, pardon the term, freeloading.
Yes.
Basically deriving benefits that somebody else has expended
Exactly right.
effort and expense to negotiate, but they're not having to pay anything for it.
And see, and that's based on another court decision that anyone that is in the same job gets the same benefits. So that's a court decision, but when you have a union, there's another court decision that says if the majority of persons vote for the union, then that union becomes the bargaining agent for that entire group, and you have to pay your dues. So the so-called right to work or right to rob or whatever you want to call that, that repeals the mandate where a person has to pay for those negotiating services, for the legal protections, for all of those things that the union has negotiated and as the other members have had to pay for. So it's not a good thing. And what the states that have so-called right to work, they have all a lower standard of living, lower pay levels, all of that sort of thing.
Right.
So it's not a good thing
Not
for the state.
necessarily a group that we want Minnesota to
That's
be a
right.
part of when
Yeah.
you look at the results of it. Let me just ask you this, Jim. I know you're known as a very hard campaigner, and I'm very proud of the fact that you have door-knocked this district repeatedly, and you talked to a lot of people,
talked to a lot
and
of
you were
people,
very
yes.
diligent, I know, as a senator in keeping in touch with your constituents. What are the top concerns that you're hearing as you talk to voters in Eagan and Burnsville this time around?
Funny thing, much of it is the same. It's still education. And right now, we've added more of Burnsville to this district. We used to be Senate District 38. We are now Senate District 51, which includes a couple more precincts in Burnsville that we've never knocked before. And when I ask people what their principal issue is, a lot of them have brought up the Burnsville school system going to 4-day weeks. And that was only, they dropped that idea
Which they
about
took
2
off
weeks
the
ago.
table
Yes.
now, yeah. But it was only after they did a series of public hearings, one of which I attended actually, and they heard from voters who were very upset about
Yes,
that idea.
very upset. And that was to some degree, that was a shift of costs too, because if you don't have, let's say you have a 4-day week, which day of the week? Is that Friday, Wednesday, Monday? And do you have to get child care? And who
Right.
pays for that? Well, now
Right.
it's the parents that have to do it.
As usual, our time has run out. Jim Carlson, candidate for Minnesota State Senate, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.